We're going to look at how a localized criminal operation in Colombia transformed into a global empire seemingly overnight and in the process completely reshaped the international drug trade.
A decent man who exports flowers. You know, it sounds almost comical now, but that is exactly how Pablo Escobar publicly described himself in the early days. He deliberately cultivated this image of a humble, everyday businessman. But as we're going to see, that facade directly contradicts the terrifying, highly industrialized reality of the violent empire we're about to explore.
$60 million. And no, that's not a yearly figure. We are talking about his estimated daily illegal profits at the absolute peak of his empire. Every single day. It's a mind-boggling number that really establishes the scale of what we're talking about today, generating revenues of up to $25 billion annually. But how on earth did he get there so fast?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at the perfect breeding ground.
You really can't understand Escobar's meteoric rise without first understanding the incredibly volatile environment in Colombia that bred his cartel in the first place. Decades of political instability and a complete lack of state control had created a massive power vacuum. It started back in 1948 when populist politician Jorge Eliezer Gaitán was assassinated. That triggered a brutal, decade-long civil war known as La Violencia, where over 200,000 people died. Out of that chaos, by 1964, guerrilla groups like the FARC had emerged, essentially taking over huge swaths of rural jungles. And just as the country was deeply fractured, the 1970s hit. Worldwide demand for illegal narcotics, specifically cocaine in the US, just absolutely exploded. Colombia had the perfect climate for growing coca plants and practically zero law enforcement capable of stopping it.
Zooming in on the city of Medellin itself, the population had absolutely exploded. We're talking going from just 60,000 back in 1905 to over 1 million by the time Escobar hit his early 20s. This kind of rapid, totally uncontrolled urbanization brought rampant poverty. For young Pablo Escobar, growing up in that urban squalor, it meant he was surrounded by a massive, desperate recruiting ground for gangs and criminal enterprises.
Which brings us to his actual transition, moving from street-level contraband to international cocaine.
So how does a kid who allegedly started out by stealing gravestones, literally sanding off the names to resell them, become an international kingpin? Well, it didn't happen overnight. It was a step-by-step escalation. Step 1. He started out selling contraband cigarettes and stealing cars in Medellin. Step 2. He and his associates stepped things up to high-profile ransom kidnappings to acquire some quick capital. By Step 3, he's moving into smuggling marijuana. But Step 4, that was the real game changer. In the mid-1970s, as the disco scene was booming in cities like New York and Miami, Escobar pivoted directly to the incredibly lucrative cocaine trade. He started by just delivering coca paste to processing facilities, but quickly figured out he could cut out the middlemen and fly fully processed cocaine out of Colombia himself.
But 1976 is where his truly ruthless strategy crystallized. He gets arrested with 18 kilograms of coca paste. Now, his first instinct was just to try and bribe the arresting officers and the judges. Standard practice, right? But when that failed, he didn't panic. He just had the arresting officers murdered so they couldn't testify. And just like that, the authorities dropped the case. So the crucial takeaway here is that this early incident solidified his horrific plata o plomo, silver or lead, approach to dealing with the government. He learned very early on that extreme violence could literally make the law disappear.
Now, extreme violence is one thing, but to reach a global scale, he had to master the supply chain.
Escobar wasn't just selling drugs on street corners anymore. He completely revolutionized international logistics. Through his associates, the cartel basically bought Norman's Cay, an entire island in the Bahamas, and converted it into a massive private depot. They'd offload huge planes from Colombia and reload the product onto smaller, undetectable planes headed for the US, moving over 300 kilograms a day just through that one island. They hired pilots like the infamous Barry Seal to fly low under the radar across the Gulf of Mexico, executing these crazy rural airdrops to ground teams waiting out in Louisiana. They even innovated by using commercial boats to tow small, drug-loaded submarines just beneath the surface of the water. He completely bypassed traditional borders to feed the massive US market.
And those insanely aggressive supply chain tactics absolutely worked. The results were monopolistic. Escobar's Medellín Cartel seized roughly 80% of the entire world's cocaine trade at their peak. Think about that. It wasn't just a cartel, it was a sprawling industry disguised as a syndicate.
Which leads us to the inevitable result of that kind of monopoly: bribes, bullets, and billions.
With this global monopoly, the cartel was generating so much cash, they literally couldn't figure out how to spend it or even hide it fast enough. Believe it or not, $1,000, That's the amount the cartel was spending every single week just on rubber bands. Let that sink in for a second. $1,000 a week purely on the rubber bands needed to hold their massive stacks of cash together.
They fundamentally struggled to manage this obscene level of wealth. Escobar purchases a 20-square-kilometer estate called Hacienda Nápoles. He flies in a private zoo full of zebras, elephants, and hippos, and, by the way, descendants of those hippos still roam around Colombia today. When they ran out of things to buy, they bought mansions and installed retractable jacuzzis just to hide tens of millions of dollars in secret compartments underneath them. Honestly, there was so much physical cash sitting around in walls and basements that up to 10% of it was simply written off every year. Why? Because it was literally eaten by rats or destroyed by water damage.
Yet despite all this, he maintained what we can call the Robin Hood facade.
See, Escobar masterfully curated this public image as a savior of the poor, and it protected him for years. He bought the adulations of Medellin citizens by building soccer stadiums, heavily funding the Atletico national soccer team, literally handing out free cash in poor neighborhoods, and letting the public visit his exotic zoo completely for free. But the reality behind that facade? Absolutely brutal. While he's playing Robin Hood, he murdered Colombia's justice minister in traffic. He funded a massive guerrilla siege on the Palace of Justice that resulted in the deaths of half the Supreme Court judges just to destroy vast amounts of criminal evidence. He even bombed a commercial airliner, Avianca Flight 203, killing 107 innocent passengers just to target one single politician who it turns out wasn't even on the plane. He was simultaneously buying love and waging a bloody industrialized war on the Colombian state.
So why the shift into politics? Why wage this massive war? Well, his brief political career and the wave of terrorism that followed were ultimately driven by one omnipresent, overwhelming fear: being extradited to a U.S. maximum security prison. Every move was strategic. He ran for Congress in 1982 specifically to acquire parliamentary immunity. When he was forced out of that, he pivoted right back to violence, eventually paying off the National Assembly in 1991 to rewrite the Constitution and ban the U.S. extradition treaty entirely. Once extradition was safely off the table, he happily negotiated a voluntary surrender. But even that was a total sham. He negotiated the right to build his own luxury prison, La Catedral, complete with a football pitch, a waterfall bar, and a telescope to watch the city, where he just kept running his empire. Everything he did was calculated to stay in Colombia, where his money and violence kept him permanently above the law.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Was Pablo Escobar's unprecedented rise simply a product of his own twisted logistical genius, or was he really just the tragic symptom of a failing state, ripped apart by civil war and poverty? If he hadn't stepped into that power vacuum, would someone else have done the exact same thing? It's a dark but absolutely fascinating look at how environment and pure ambition collide to make history. Thanks for joining me today, and keep questioning the history behind the headline.